the Emu War. In 1932, the Australian government declared war on birds, not as a joke, not as a figure of speech. The Minister for Defence signed off on it. Soldiers were deployed, machine guns were issued, 10,000 rounds of ammunition were loaded onto a truck and driven into the Western Australian wheat belt with orders to open fire. The birds won. Not narrowly, not on a technicality. They won so comprehensively that a Member of Parliament suggested the emus should be awarded the medals. That much you might have heard. What almost nobody knows is why those soldiers were there in the first place. Because the emus were never really the problem. The emus were the last thing to go wrong in a plan that had been quietly failing for 13 years. Go back to 1919, the First World War has ended. Australia has hundreds of thousands of returning soldiers and absolutely no idea what to do with them. So the government offers them land, vast amounts of it, out past the existing farms on the dry inland edge of Western Australia. Clear it, plant wheat, build a life. It was called the Soldier Settlement Scheme, and on paper it sounded generous. On the ground, it was less generous. The good land near the coast was already taken. What was left was marginal country, with thin soil and rain that arrived whenever it felt like it. Most of the men had never farmed anything. They were handed blocks that experienced farmers had already inspected, thought about carefully, and walked away from. Then, in 1929, the global economy fell over. Wheat prices collapsed. The government promised subsidies to keep the settlers afloat, and then, in the great tradition of governments everywhere, did not pay them. So by 1932 these men were broke, isolated, and in a mood, and then the emus arrived. Emus migrate. Every year after breeding season, they move inland looking for water. For thousands of years that migration crossed empty scrub. But the scrub had now been cleared, planted, and critically watered. The settlers had built dams and troughs for their livestock. From an emu's point of view, someone had just installed a chain of service stations across the desert, with catering. Around 20,000 of them turned up. An emu stands nearly 2 meters tall, weighs up to 50 kilos, and runs at 50 kilometers an hour. It does not politely step over a wheat fence. It goes through it, which then lets in every rabbit within a day's hop. So the birds ate the crops, flattened the crops they could not eat, and destroyed the fencing that was the only thing holding back the rabbits. At which point a group of the settlers, being ex-soldiers, did the thing ex-soldiers do. They went to Canberra and asked for machine guns. This is the part of the story where a sensible government says no. They got the machine guns. Sir George Pearce, the Minister for Defence, approved the request. 2 Lewis guns, 10,000 rounds, and Major Gwynedd Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. Pearce had his own reasons, none of which involved agriculture. The soldiers would get target practice. The government would finally look like it was doing something for the settlers. And a newsreel crew was sent along to film the whole triumph, because it would make outstanding propaganda. That newsreel footage does not survive. There is a reason for that. The first engagement was on the 2nd of November, 1932. The settlers herded about 50 emus towards the gunners, and here the first small flaw in the plan revealed itself. Emus do not advance in a line. They do not hold formation. The instant they were in range, they scattered in every direction at once at full speed, because they are birds, and nobody had explained the rules to them. The gunners fired. A handful went down, the rest simply left. Meredith adjusted. 2 days later, he set an ambush at a dam near Campion, where over 1,000 emus came to drink. This time he waited until they were close. Textbook. The gun opened up, killed about a dozen birds, and then jammed. The remaining 1,000 or so departed at speed, presumably filing the experience away for later. By this point, Meredith had noticed something he found genuinely unsettling. The emus were learning. They had stopped moving in large flocks and split into small scattered groups, and each group seemed to have one bird that stayed upright and still while the others fed, watching the horizon. When that bird moved, the whole group moved. The emus had developed lookouts. Meredith wrote this down in an official military report, which is not a sentence anyone at the Department of Defence expected to read that year. He also discovered they were extraordinarily hard to kill. An emu hit several times would frequently keep running, apparently on principle. Meredith wrote that if he had a military division that could absorb bullets, the way these birds did, it could face any army in the world. He compared them to Zulu warriors. He said they faced machine guns like tanks. This is the commander of the operation, in writing, comparing the enemy favourably to his own side. He then tried mounting a Lewis gun on the back of a truck to chase them down. 2 problems emerged immediately. The truck could not outrun an emu across open ground, and the ride was so rough that the gunner could not aim at anything, including the sky. The attempt ended when an emu ran into the vehicle, tangled itself in the steering, and put the truck through a fence. After 6 days, Meredith had fired around 2,500 rounds, confirmed kills, somewhere between 50 and 200 birds, out of 20,000. The story reached federal parliament, where it was received with the seriousness it deserved, which is to say none. It reached the newspapers, which had the time of their lives. The operation was withdrawn on the 8th of November. The settlers, undeterred, begged for the guns to come back. They did on the 13th of November and stayed until early December. Meredith's final claim was 986 emus killed using 9,860 rounds, exactly 10 bullets per bird. He also claimed another 2,500 died later of their wounds, a figure that nobody could verify, nobody could check, and nobody has ever believed. Even taking his best number at face value, that is under 5% of the birds. Now here is the part that actually matters, and the reason this is more than a funny story. The problem was solved, not by the army, by fences and money. The government introduced a bounty, paying settlers directly for emu beaks. It worked immediately. In 6 months of 1934, more than 57,000 bounties were claimed. Then the state built and subsidized proper exclusion fencing, the kind of barrier an emu cannot simply stroll through. 57,000 birds, handled by ordinary people who were paid to handle them. 986 birds, handled by an artillery unit with 2 machine guns and a film crew. The military lesson from the Emu War is one that armies went on to relearn repeatedly through the 20th century, usually at much greater cost. Automatic weapons are devastating against a mass target and close to useless against a fast, dispersed, adaptive one. Meredith had a tool built for trench warfare, and he was fighting an enemy that had never heard of a trench and would not have used one anyway. But there is a second lesson underneath, and it is the reason the whole thing happened at all. The Australian government could not fix the real problem. It could not raise the price of wheat. It could not undo the fact that it had handed exhausted veterans a stretch of land that could not support them, and then broken its promise to help. Those failures were expensive, slow, and deeply embarrassing. Sending a machine gun after some birds was cheap, fast, and looked decisive. So that is what it did. The emus, who had been making that same walk toward water long before anyone drew a border around Western Australia, kept walking. They are still there. They are on the coat of arms, which is a bold choice for a nation that once lost to them. There are more emus in Australia today than there were in 1932. The soldier settlement scheme was, by every measure, a failure. Most of the blocks were eventually abandoned. 20,000 birds and a couple of machine guns is the part everyone remembers, and fair enough. It is a very good story, but it is worth remembering the rest, because the funniest war in history was really the loudest symptom of a government that had promised a group of men a future and could not deliver it. The emus were never the enemy. They were just the only enemy anyone could shoot at.